Good morning, everyone. Half a day. And greetings from my homeland of Guahan. We, as you may or may not know, are in the Micronesian region of the Pacific. And so it's 3:30 in the morning. So I'm not typically one who drinks coffee, but of course, naturally I've drank coffee and now my heart is racing out of my chest. So if I appear extra nervous and extra shaky, it's probably the coffee. And I say that because it's very nice to be in the company of other Pacific folks. I actually joined you folks for your conference a few years ago, together with the Guam Coalition Against Sexual Assault and Family Violence. And so it's nice to see some familiar faces. And it's also nice to see what looks like might be some folks from Guahan, as well as some CHamoru names, and so CHamoru families who are in diaspora living in the United States. And so as I begin my presentation, I wanted to begin with addressing the question of who are we? And so our native people we are the Chamorros, and we are native to the Mariana Islands in the Pacific region, obviously, in Micronesia. Okay, I'm putting away my devices. I'm just going to be present and hope I stay within time because it's distracting for me. But we native Chamorros are the indigenous population of the Mariana Island chain located in the Micronesian region of the Pacific. And so where are we? As you can see in this map, this island chain here is the Mariana Islands. We are in the North Pacific and in the West Pacific. And so as you can see here, we are very close to Asia, and our migration into the Pacific is theorized to have begun out of South China into Taiwan and following Austronesian descent kind of this way and then up into the Pacific. And we are noted to be one of the first of peoples to populate the Pacific. And in the Mariana Island chain, as you can see here, it's all these green dots. And so my home island of Guahan is here as the southernmost point. And to the north of us, all the remaining islands are the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. And I just wanted to point out that collectively, we are Chamorro people who've been politically divided, largely due to history. And so as you can tell from our location on this map, we have a very important significance in terms of our geographical location in the Pacific. We are currently, and when I say we, I'm referring both to Guahan as well as to the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. We are both affiliated with the United States, with Guahan being an unincorporated territory of the US, which can be akin to a modern day colony. And so the island of Guahan is and continues to be on the United Nations list of non-self-governing territories, one of the remaining 17 left in the world, not having ever had the opportunity to exercise our right to political self-determination. To the north of Guahan, with the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, our cousins, if you will, to the north have had that opportunity by way of establishing a Commonwealth relationship with the United States. However, it's noteworthy to mention that in the last 5 years or so, I don't know the exact year, but their sovereignty in some ways has been what I call hijacked, in that a federalization process has occurred with a number of different functions taken over by the US government. And so they currently have established a political status commission to revisit their political status and relationship with the United States. And so, again, North Pacific, West Pacific in the Mariana Island chain. And so I just wanted to give a little glimpse of Itanota, or our land. And these are some pictures of our islands, very relatively untouched, especially as you move to the Northern Islands. And so on Guahan, we're the southernmost of the tip, and in the Northern Islands, you have primarily Saipan, which is the main population center of the CNMI, along with Luta and Tinian, that are inhabited. There are also a number of small islands, very sparsely inhabited. And when I say very, I mean like in the ballpark of 20 people or less, because there has been migration to these islands islands. However, volcanic activity oftentimes has been cause for relocation. Another thing I wanted to mention about our land that is noteworthy to understand is in looking at the colonized indigenous experience is the contamination and the environmental racism against our land, particularly in the island of Guahan as the site of a number of US military bases. And so the island of Guahan in particular is occupied by the Department of Defense, with the US DoD land holdings in the ballpark of 29 to 31% of the island. So roughly 1/3 of the island is occupied by US military bases. Moving along, and this is probably the fun part in terms of reaching across and sharing with our Pacific neighbors, is our traditional beliefs and practices. And so as I shared, even though Chamorros are politically divided, we do share and have varying degrees of acculturation in terms of our traditional beliefs and practices. And so we do believe in our Tautomona, which are our ancestral spirits who are very much a part of our traditional spirituality and continue to today, particularly when this belief system has largely been demonized and attacked, particularly with modern Western religion. And in the case of Guahan and the CNMI, primarily the Catholic Church is the predominant Christian church that exists in our islands. We do still have our traditional practices of our Zo'omti, who practice our traditional CHamoru, which is our traditional medicine. And this comes by way of the preparation of amut or medicines, as well as traditional massage. And this is largely guided by and in communion with our traditional spirits, or our Tautomona, who guide the healing process. We are a community and a society that's very much intact with our traditional reciprocity practices, referred to as our Tintuli practice, which is our system of give and share and take and helping each other throughout the community. We have a high reverence for our elders, or our manyaina, who are parental figures and play a very critical role traditionally and currently in terms of their leadership in the family clan systems. And so connected to this, we have our matrilineal, matricentric, and matrifocal system. And so traditionally, consistent with our matrilineal practices, land was transmitted along the lines of the women. And we'll spend quite a bit of time in this presentation looking at the role of women, primarily because, of course, when we're talking about domestic violence, family violence, we know that women are primary victims and survivors of that experience. And so part of our matrilineal and matricentric matrifocal line is looking at the role of the Magat Haga in complementary relationship with the Magat Lahi. And so the Magat Haga is a female chief. So while we traditionally had male chiefs, who are the Magat Lahi, he was typically, our family clans were led not just by the male chief, but complemented by the female chief, the Magat Haga. And so this kind of highlights the primacy of the Tsetlu relationship, right? And Tsetlu is our siblings, in that the Magat Lahi and the Magat Haga were typically siblings, the oldest ranking male and the oldest ranking female in the family clan. And so it's not reflective necessarily of the romantic relationship of a husband and wife, so much as that of a sibling relationship. Another traditional practice and value which we continue very, very strong, not just throughout Guahan and the Mariana Islands, but also throughout our entire Micronesian region, is that of Famat Tautau. And Famat Tautau is the closest conceptualization of what is referred to in the Western context as respect. And I don't, if you note, I don't even write the word respect near Famat Tautau, because Famat Tautau is a concept that is much more encompassing and deeper in terms of looking at our dynamics with others. And I say this in that it transcends the Western concept of respect, because it really does permeate not just the individual, but the individual in the context and representative of their larger clan. So much of what we do, what we think, what we say is connected to our ancestral line, as well as the children that are yet to be born. So the intentionality of actions really is reflective of that as we decide on and make decisions for the clan. And the last traditional belief that I list here is mamalo, and that is of shame and humility, which permeates and goes very much hand in hand with Tamatauta, or our belief system of respect. And so as we transition to look at family violence, this is an experience that, as we know, is consistent with Indigenous peoples throughout the globe, particularly Indigenous peoples who live in colonized homelands. And so we see these phenomenon when we look at Kanaka Maoli or Hawaiians, when we look at the Maoris of Aotearoa, when we look at the Aboriginal population in Australia. And so we see the intersectionality of colonization, of Indigenous peoples, and of family violence. And so I wanted to just slowly dissect out these different pieces as we move through this presentation together. And so I wanted to begin by just kind of sharing the operational definition of family violence. And this is taken from our Guam Family Violence Act of 1998, defined with these three characteristics below. Our island actually, we have considerably high rates of domestic violence, family violence, which would seem inconsistent with the traditional values that I just presented. So it really does kind of raise the question of how is that possible, right? Because 1 + 1 should equal 2. But when you intersperse and you contextualize it over the backdrop of colonization, then high incidence rates of family violence, as well as traditional nuances of the consensus of violence, then you can see how this continues to be a problem today. And so our definition of our law is there. And I wanted to also say that our island is known, when I say our island, I'm speaking specifically to Guahan, is known to have one of the most robust legislations on family violence in the United States. We have mandatory arrest laws. We have a family violence registry that is available online, and just different components in terms of how we engage adjudication of family violence cases. Okay, so as we begin to get into the details, I wanted to share some statistics on Guahan, prefacing it with, of course, we always know about the underreporting of cases as a phenomenon that happens in many places, in most places, and certainly in our Mariana Islands, as well as what's pretty signature to the territories, and that is a very limited capacity for the integration of data as well as data analysis. And so I'm not a biostatistician, I'm merely presenting statistics that I've been able to gain access to. And I should also say that the information in this presentation is taken from a chapter that I've written in a book that's up for publication in the next, before the end of the year, out of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. And so looking specifically at these raw numbers, like I said, there's not a whole lot of calculation. We can't draw a whole lot of conclusions from these data that I'm about to present, but it does give us a little bit of a context. And so looking specifically at Guahan, the Guam Police Department, DART reported intimate partner violence statistics totaling these number of cases in the past few years. And these cases include cases of kidnapping, intimidation, simple assault, and aggravated assault, as reported by DART. And it's important to note that on the island of Guahan, we have, our current population is in the ballpark of 170,000 people. Continuing along, the Guam Statistical Yearbook in 2017 reported that Pacific Islanders, and this is of different groups, not just Chamorros, comprised between 81.3 and 85.5% of perpetrators in that year span. In addition, looking at the Guam Stop Violence Against Women data from 2019, Chamorros represented 32% of victims of violence and 30% of offenders, and Chamorros comprise roughly 37% of our population locally on Guahan. Consistent with what you see across the US, we see that the perpetrators were primarily male at nearly 80% and female perpetrators at about 1/5 at 21%. This table is some raw data of Child Protective Services comparing or looking at numbers of received cases between 2012, reported cases, I'm sorry, and 2017. And so as you can see, it looks like the numbers are decreasing, which, you know, usually is something to celebrate. However, I do want to caveat by saying that there was a spike in the report of cases because there was a situation in which a school vice principal hadn't reported a case of child abuse to the authorities, who is a mandated reporter. And so she was prosecuted, and that really made a case. And so there was some degree of over-reporting for a few years out of fear of that. And so, of course, as we move towards the more current and recent years, most particularly this past year, we are seeing a spike, particularly with CPS cases specific to child neglect, largely because of educational neglect secondary to the COVID situation that we're experiencing at present. And so moving on to this next table, looking at type of maltreatment, again, between these years through 2017, we see, of course, most typically physical abuse and sexual abuse are the ones that actually come to the point of being reported, even though emotional abuse and neglect, of course, particularly physical, have high co-founding reporting rates as well. I want to mention that sexual abuse and family incest, not just in the Mariana Islands, but throughout Micronesia, is very, very high. Experiences that we have. I know whenever we talk about child sexual abuse by clergy in the US, the parish in Boston comes to mind. But when you compare the number or the incidence of clergy child abuse on our island in comparison to Boston, our numbers are way higher proportionally. We currently have an ongoing case against the Catholic Church on island, where there's well over 200 cases that have been reported against molestation by priests that has occurred over the last 30-ish years. And we also see high incest rates. The majority of our child sexual abuse cases, of course, occurring within the context of family. Just last week, there was a report in the media that it was in the ballpark of 70 to 80% of our child sexual abuse cases as being in the context of family. And so that's certainly not good news at all. Just a little bit of piece of information with regards to this. It's noteworthy to mention that throughout the Micronesian region, even the word to mention and to utter the word sex in some communities, as in the Chukis community in the Federated States of Micronesia, is considered to be taboo. So when you consider that degree of taboo, you can see how what you resist persists, and these cultural taboos around sex sometimes manifest in high levels of sexual assault. Moving on to more numbers on Guahan. These are looking at specific risk factors of child abuse cases. And again, this is consistent with what we see throughout the US, where it's co-founding with alcohol abuse, as well as in more problematic of late has been drug use, particularly in response to the use of ice or crystal methamphetamines. Okay, a little bit more numbers. Now we're starting to look here at elderly abuse and the type of abuse ranked. And so we look at 3 years, the numbers of referrals consistently increasing. Here's where you see overrepresentation by CHamoru's in the breakdown of the percentage by ethnicity, comprising in the ballpark of 67 to 69%, and remembering that CHamoru's comprise about 37% of the population. So you see major overrepresentation when it comes to elderly abuse. And the most common form of elderly abuse is financial and property abuse in Guahan, and in the CNMI, this is referred to as fraud. Okay, hang on a moment here. Okay, let's Turning our scope now to the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, even more difficult to get good numbers. And so we see child abuse and neglect referrals across the different islands, primarily in the island of Saipan, which is not surprising in that it is the concentrated population center of the CNMI. But we also see it in Tinian and in Luta or Rota. And then in terms of types of child abuse cases, this is what we see here. Interesting with what they do, which is why the numbers aren't identical, is that they also include confounding factors as part of their reporting to include suicide, teenage pregnancy, drug use, and minor sex trafficking in their tally counts. And so now we turn to the literature to see what's going on, what's happening here. And so I wanted to share a quote from a study that was done. It's relatively old data in the early 2000s, where some academics from the University of Guam examined mental health issues and its trajectory with indigenous and Western cultural ideas. And so I want to share a quote from a participant of their study, their qualitative study, that stated, quote, "I think there's a lot of spouse abuse in my community, and I think a lot of that stems from changes in the ancient Chamorro culture. Women used to be in control. They were the ones everyone respected. Somewhere along the lines, things changed, and now it's the man who acts as the master of the house. If they feel they're not in control in the house, they react by thinking, if I smack you a little harder, maybe you will notice that I am in control." And this quote is from a female, 38 years old, who was Chamorro. And so, so when we look at family violence, we look at what's happening, as I shared earlier, in terms of our matrilineal, matricentric, matrifocal line. It would seem inconsistent that family violence rates would be so high against women. But as you can see here, with colonization and the introduction of patriarchal value systems, it's likely resulted in serious role confusion in the relationship between men and women. I also wanted to, and so this sort of position and a shift from the matrilineal to the patriarchal society, in a research that was also done in the late 90s by Dr. Juan Rapadas, discusses the idea and the possibility that the resulting shift from the patriarchal or to the patriarchal has resulted in low self-concept and self-esteem among Native women. And so now we're beginning to look at historical trauma. And a definition provided by Braveheart et al. Is a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across generations, including the lifespan, which emanates from the massive experience of group trauma. And so when you look at what's happened to Chamorros historically, you can see how historical trauma is certainly something that has been the footprint of our experience. And research across different indigenous populations have indicated traditionally what has been assigned to the experience of trauma in Native peoples has been a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, right? A PTSD diagnosis. And we saw this in American Indians who've experienced similarly with us in Micronesia and in the Marianas, experiences of not just colonization, but genocide, assimilation, and social exclusion. And so what has been reported in the literature is the inadequacy of this PTSD diagnosis, and rather contextualizing it as historical trauma that has occurred over generations. And so Evans Campbell's has revealed in the literature 3 criteria for historical trauma. The first is that it was experienced by many people. There are high levels of stress that was generated during that experience. And the third is that outsiders perpetrated the events with destructive intent. And so part of this model or this criteria indicates the impacts on the individual, the family, as well as the larger community. And so further looking at the literature and the data that's available, we have Gurn et al., who, and I was recently at the United Nations in the last 5 years with the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And one of the critical issues at that time was discussion about the experience of Indigenous women in the country of Canada. And so Gurn et al. Reported that Indigenous women were twice as likely to experience IPV as compared to non-Indigenous women in Canada. Incarceration rates of the Canadian Indigenous people was grossly overrepresented, representing only 3% in the population, but 27% of incarcerated people. That was in the years of 2017 and 2018. And of those who were incarcerated, 50% reported experiences of family violence as children. And so at the UN, addressing and seeking out international intervention and remedy was solicited as a result of the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in Canada who were found to be 12 times more likely to get killed or go missing as compared to other ethnic groups. And so we see Gurn et al. Reported this phenomenon not just with Indigenous Canadian women, but also experienced by the Maoris in Aotearoa, as well as with Aboriginal Australians. And so we see this experience throughout the spectrum in terms of looking at Indigenous women who've experienced colonization. And in the context of Canada, of course, we know about the residential schools that Indigenous peoples were subjected to in terms of cultural erasure. But in the midst of all the bad news, there's always resiliency factors. And so this picture that I have in this slide is a depiction of a legend that we have on Guahan that is called the Legend of the Women Who Saved Guahan. And so as you can see in the middle is a big fish. And so we have a legend that there was a big fish who was gnawing and eating away at our island. And the men, attempted to catch the fish with their spears and with everything else. And the women just silently watched as they attempted all of their interventions, and decided collectively to cut their hair and to weave it into a net. And it was the net that was used of their hair that was used to capture this fish that saved Guam. So women are credited culturally but as manifested in this legend as being the saviors of the island. Moving on then and looking at and contextualizing further the idea of historical trauma. And so when it raises the question then, what is it that Chamorros on our island have experienced, or in our islands have experienced, that is historically traumatic? And so clearly not only have we had a history of colonization by way of literally a current colonial condition, but in addition to that, we've experienced war trauma during World War II, both on Guahan as well as in the Northern Mariana Islands. We have and continue to be at high risk for poverty, being some of the poorer jurisdictions in the United States. Very seldom do you see these numbers relative to the territories, because we're not included in data when it comes to the United States, because we are not literally a state. However, if you look specifically for the data on the territories, you'll see how people of the territories really fare much poorer than that of what's reported across the US. Clearly, there's structural racism, not just by virtue of the political colonization that exists, but also in terms of different systems that were implemented in terms of the structure of our governments, as well as the in-migration of populations, particularly, and a good example would be the University of Guam, where we have our administering power and people of the administering power, which is the United States, dominating many of our power structures, particularly at the top. Land dispossession, I talked about the presence of military bases and how literally land takings, traditional indigenous lands were taken for military purposes and through the use of eminent domain, which resulted in the disconnection of Pacific peoples, of our Chamorro peoples to our land. And as is consistent throughout the Pacific, our connection to land is incredibly strong and is incredibly defining in terms of where we fit in the world and how we see things and how we connect to our lands and our ancestors. And so land dispossession really in so many ways is a severing of our very being by that disconnection. Similarly, we have the banning of our indigenous language that was very clear since the American colonial period that began for us after the Spanish-American War, which was when the Marianas was first, at least Guahan was first given to, or was technically purchased by the United States through the Treaty of Paris. And so our language, of course, was forbidden in schools, and the usual typical trajectory of what you see for Pacific Islanders in the US context. The demonization of our traditional spirituality. Our first colonial experience for the entire Mariana Islands was with colonization by Spain and the establishment of Catholic missions in the mid-1600s. And I just want to underscore mid-1600s because, as you can see, that was a very long time ago. In relative comparison, even to Hawaii, that was 200 years before the colonization of Hawaii. So our colonial experience is very far and deep and wide. And some would argue that Chamorros, if you look at the list of 17 in the world, that Chamorros are clearly the longest colonized, continuously colonized peoples of the world. And as a result, clearly there is identity and role confusion, lots of cultural erasure, cultural invalidation, cultural demonization. And last point in terms of looking at the traumatic experiences is the introduction of patriarchy, which clearly shifted not just the way we experienced and established our clan functions, but also very connected to what's happening in terms of family violence. And so if we were to develop a formula for family violence, you've got the historical backdrop of those experiences in addition to confounding factors in the present. So it's not just the history of colonization, but the ongoing colonization that exists. And then the experience of war that intergenerationally has crossed our peoples. And then the confounding factors in the present of substance use disorders, which span from alcohol to heroin from the times of the Vietnam War, because we have very high enlistment rates in the US military, to our current struggles with opioids as well as with crystal methamphetamines. You see poverty that has been systemic and that has not been remedied and continues from the past to the present. When this is also added with an abuse history, which we know is intergenerational, and unless there's some concerted intervention, continues to transmit from generation to generation. When you have limited educational attainment and youthful parenting, then clearly there's a formula, very high formula for family violence to occur in the modern context. Okay, and so moving along, I wanted to share another study by a local researcher, Dr. Patricia Taimanglo, whose maiden name is Pierre in 1998. Her dissertation research, she looked at intergenerational transmission of historic community trauma and Chamorros living on Guahan. And actually, she interviewed therapists who work with Chamorros. And her research indicated that such experiences pose mental health concerns. Right? It's not such a hard concept to understand, right? That when you've got the experience of colonization and all this heavy trauma that has occurred to the collectivity of Chamorros, that clearly mental health outcomes would be poor and that it would be problematic. And we see this as well in the literature as reported by Braveheart et al., referring or sharing the prevalence of high psychiatric disorders among American Indians, Native Alaskans on reservations, and similarly as with Chamorros, as a result of the collective, communal, and generational transmission that manifests today, that continue by way of racism, oppression, and discrimination. And of course, that being a very heated topic when we look at movements such as the BLM movement that's happening in the continental United States. Okay, so shifting a little bit and looking at Manggafa. So Manggafa is our traditional word for the family. And so I'm going to share some research, the literature, in terms of looking at our traditional systems of the family, of the role of the women, of our traditional way or reported accounts of traditional parenting, just so that we peel back the layers to pre-colonization as best that we can. And so This is a quote that describes the family in the context of the region of Micronesia by Dr. Robert Underwood, who's the former president of our university, a long-term Chamorro activist, and our former congressional delegate to the US Congress, and he was there for 10 years. And so he states and describes the family as, quote, "The family in its various manifestations throughout Micronesia is the unit that traditionally has kept society intact, responsive and responsible in the face of change. Micronesians, by an overwhelming majority, see families as the basic building blocks of society. Moreover, they tend to see each other not as individuals with particular professions or personalities, but as people from certain families. This family orientation is healthy and necessary for the continued survival as Micronesians, for it is the family context that most serious decisions occur and most decisions are made." And this continues to persist, because in spite of colonization in the past and the present, many of our traditional practices have kind of gone covertly undercover, if you will, and continue to be practiced in our clans. And now looking more specifically at the traditional role that women played, as I shared earlier, we have the Manggafa, or the female chief. We were traditionally matricentric, matrifocal, and matrilineal, and that land was transmitted along the mother's line. And so what this functionally meant was when a man and a woman got together, then the family would reside in the woman's clan land because men had no access to title. And so that was one of the traditional protective factors in terms of family violence, is that families lived on the clan land of the women in the context of her brothers, her uncles, her father, her grandfather. And so that in and of itself was a protective factor in terms of the dynamics between men and women. Women were revered for our childbearing abilities, and there are numerous accounts that refers to the fact that the women really were seen because they were children were birthed from our bodies, that children really were primarily under the ownership and auspice of the mother when it came to parental tensions. And I also wanted to share a little bit about the legend of Punten and Fuuna, now more referred to as the legend of Punten and Fotna. And so if you indulge me for a second here, I'll share a short video clip that discusses this account of creation through the lens of our culture.
Almost every culture has its own account of creation, and each one tells a unique story. Punten and Fuuna were the gods of creation to the ancient Chamorros.
Punten and Fuuna were brother and sister. They devised a plan in which their supernatural forces would be put to extremely powerful use. Punten had his sister take his body to create parts of the world. His eyes became the sun and the moon. His eyebrows, rainbows. His back, the earth.
Fuuna used her energy and spirit to bring life to her brother's body. With her power, she made the sunshine and the earth blossom.
After bringing new life to the world, Fuuna threw her body into the land, from which emerged the first human beings.
This is one of the most important oral histories of the CHamoru people, as it tells about their culture.
This account tells that the CHamoru people had their own form of spiritual beliefs before Christianity was introduced. It also tells us that men and women were both respected and shared power and responsibility. And the unique brother-sister relationship between the two gods reflects the matrilineal system of the CHamoru people. Where brothers and sisters work together to protect the land, raise the children, and provide for the well-being of the clan.
Okay, so thank you for letting me share that. Bring my PowerPoint back up. Okay, and so the legend of Fortna and Ponten clearly shows and evidences the primacy of the sibling relationship and positions the woman as the creator goddess, right? And also centers the creation of humanity in terms of our culture. And it evidences our value of Inafat Maulik, which is the complementarity. Inafat Maulik, in my mind, refers to the collective peace that of society, right, that we attempt to or we hope to achieve. But it also, the legend really evidences the complementarity in the relationship between men and women together, working together for the clan. And so I have a few more accounts, historical accounts here that I want to share that evidences and that talks about this relationship between men and women. And so this is taken from Guampedia, which is a very reliable source on island for stuff related to Guahan and Chamorro history. And so I quote from Mendiola, Chamorros were able to find a societal equilibrium as both men and women, the eldest brother and sister, were co-equal guardians and administrators of clans and their resources. Another quote that I have, which is from an account of Freycinet, who was a French explorer. He visited the islands in the 1800s. And, you know, we have lots of books written in foreign languages in a shelf somewhere. And once in a while, they take a book and they translate it. And so this particular translation revealed a lot about our traditional culture. And so Freycinet reports, and I quote, the role of Chamorro women is having the direction of public affairs in their hands. At home, they were absolute mistresses and had the command of everything. Nothing was done without first obtaining their opinion or consent. So these accounts really speak to the primacy of the woman, right? A book written in 1998, Russell, who's an academic out of the college in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, states more reflections again on the role of women. It is clear from these accounts that while the men may have been the warriors and navigators, the women were the heads of household and were quick to assert their prerogatives. For instance, the husband did not dare give an order contrary to his wife's wishes, nor punish the children, for she would turn upon him and beat him. So this quote is of interest for two reasons. Number one, it does evidence that idea that the children were were seen more so as the possession of the mother. But it also is concerning in that it evidences that spousal abuse from the woman to the man is something that may have been sanctioned in traditional culture. Echoing these sentiments, Dr. Laura Souder, who did her dissertation looking at Chamorro women organizers in the 80s, in the late 70s. She states, quote, females, particularly elder women in the clan who were married and mothers, were powerful in all spheres of society. Through the matrilineal kinship system, women exercised control over family life, property, and inheritance. They assumed a central role and possessed strong bargaining powers in their marriage. Their esteemed status was also reflected in rituals, legends, and ceremonial events. You know, I want to underscore, and this is what I often share at home here as well, is that the fact that traditional Chamorro culture was matricentric, matrilineal, matrifocal does not mean that we left our men behind. There really was a complementarity of the relationship between men and women as co-partners in our family clans. And so Freycinet shares a couple of observations in which the men were complemented, or complementu is in our language is how we would say it. And so a child of status, whenever a child of status was born, rice was thrown at the feet of the father as a sign of respect to him. And children's names were also based on the talents of their fathers, as in the case of Nineti, which means ingenious, and Paioknyao, which is intrepid. And so fathers clearly played a very critical role in the lives of the children. More accounts from Freycinet, the French explorer, address the sanctity of the union of marriage, describing the infidelity of marital partners. So now we're starting to look at infidelity. And he described an adulterous woman who had been repudiated by her husband and sent back to her mother's house after judgment was stripped of her possessions at the same time. But he was perfectly free to avenge himself upon the seducer for the insult received, even to the point of killing him. So here again is another manifestation of violence, and you know, in the context of marriage and in the context of adulterous affairs. Another historical account that was provided by Pobre, Feyron Pobre Zamora, who is a very early account in 1601. He actually experienced our culture in the context of being in the island of Luta, which is probably the least colonized of our islands that was inhabited, in that, you know, it's smaller and had a small population. And so in some ways, the purity of his observations are evident. And I wanted to share and read again another account, and quote, when a man and a woman marry and live together in a house, although they have been married 20 or 30 years, if the husband is unfaithful to his wife or takes a mistress, and if it should anger his wife, she will leave the house, taking the children and all the household furniture and effects, and will go to the house of her parents or of other relatives, where she will remain. During all this time, the children will not acknowledge their father, even though he may pass very close to them. Before the wife will return to the husband, his relatives will have to go to great lengths to do so. If the wife is unfaithful to the husband, her relatives do not have to go to such lengths, because it is easier to obtain the husband's pardon, since the sin is considered less serious for the woman than for the men. Okay, so again, here you see the possession of the children, and you also see the primacy given to women in terms of these relationships. Continuing on with Freycinet, all the women kept it, a spear in their hand and their husband's hat on their head. In that marital guise, they then advance as a unit on the house of the guilty man. First, they lay waste his crops and tear up his cereals, trampling them down. Then they strip his fruit trees of the fruits and create an appalling mess. Finally, they descend upon the dwelling itself, and if the wretched husband has not taken precaution to be taking himself elsewhere and finding cover, they attack him too and chase him right out. Okay, so this again, you know, in terms of looking at the role of women, this is clearly not a disempowered position, right? As a matter of fact, perhaps it might be a little bit too much empowered. And so moving on from the traditional roles, I wanted to share a piece here. And this photo is actually of my mother and myself. And I've recently written a piece in a book, a republication of Daughters of the Island, specific to Chamorro women. And I wanted to share an excerpt, because all of what I just shared have been historical accounts of the relationship between men and women. But this here is my writing of what I've been taught by my own mother, my Nana, with regards to how we engage men. And so I'll read. My Nana impressed upon me that while we as women were responsible for taking care of everyone and making the best decisions in the collective interest, It is equally our responsibility to take care of our grandfathers, our fathers, our uncles, our ninus, our brothers, our sons, and our nephews. My Nana's concern was always for the clan, and this included the needs of our men. The care we provided the men in our family was not to take away from our power as women. Rather, it was to complement the tsinsuli, the reciprocal relationship that we have with them. They were our steadfast partners. They made manifest the vision that we had in the service of our family. They went fishing and hunting and erected the palapalas for the dinanyas that we coordinated. They went to work and gave us their whole paychecks. They listened as we talked through making hard decisions about the finances, our children, and our elders. They cared for our children while we went about the business of building our careers. And so clearly, this is reflective of the partnership in the relationship between men and women. And so even though it's tempting as a matrilineal society to elevate women as being above men, in actuality, clearly it was a complementary relationship where there was equality between the two genders. Now transitioning to look at the parental role. We, of course, were traditionally an agrarian society. Children were seen as wealth and as a resource, and clearly under the ownership of the mother. I wanted to share, so now we're starting to look at child abuse, right? And we're starting to look at the role of parents in terms of how we raise our kids. And I apologize that I'm doing a lot of reading of text, but these are actual word for word historical accounts. And so I think there's great value there. And this is one of my most favorite of pieces because it really speaks to the patience of parenting and very wise parenting, even in a modern context. And so Fray Juan Probe Zamora, again, the guy from 1602 in Rota, writes, and I'll quote, "While they are very young, they make their sons and daughters work and teach them to perform their tasks. Consequently, the very young know how to perform their tasks like their parents because they've been taught with great love. So great is their love for their children that it would take a long time to describe it and to sing it praises. They never spank them, and they even scold them with loving words. When a child is offended and angered by what is said to him, he will move a short distance away from his parents and turn his back to them, not wanting to face them. They will then toss sand or pebbles on the ground behind him, and after he has cried for a little while, one of his parents will go to him and with very tender words will take him in his arms and raise him to his shoulders and carry him back to where the others are gathered. Then they will always give him some of their best food, and speaking to them as if he were an adult, tell him how he should behave, admonishing him to be good. With such great love, these barbarians raise their children that they in turn grow up to be obedient and expert in their occupations and skills." So these kinds of historical accounts are very powerful in terms of reteaching and relearning for our families as to what it means to be a Chamorro parent, right? So while family violence, child abuse, the whole basket of these behaviors may be contextualized as a poor way of coping in a current modern colonial context, it is these traces to our past practices that really become very useful tools in our engagement in the therapeutic relationship with our families. This is yet another quote in terms of parenting, and again, very contrasting to abuse. And this quote actually talks about the relationship between fathers and sons and how fathers really take, by way of mentorship, their same gendered children and teach them and socialize them into the role of being men. Now switching the scope a little bit, now looking at our elders and the relationship. And I know I shared that both in all of the Mariana Islands, big problems of elderly abuse, particularly in the context of financial abuse, right? And so here's a quote from Guampedia by Marsh, who states that one of the first things written about Chamorro society was the Mañaina, who are our elders, that they were highly respected and held a lot of power. An early Spanish visitor to Guam, Fray Antonio de los Angeles in 1596, said that elders gave orders and everyone obeyed them completely. It was family elders who ruled their clans and thus ancient Chamorro society. right? And so if you can imagine that the Magalahi and the Magahagat were the two eldest siblings in the family clan, clearly they age out and continue to maintain that power until they're no longer able to manage it. Now we're shifting to a modern social service context, right? And so we know, and I cite all different kinds of manuscripts here that indicate that Indigenous peoples' experiences of historical trauma warrants the integration of culture-based interventions to facilitate healing from family violence. Okay, and so in line with this, clearly, and I know this is probably not news to anybody's ears, the importance of cultural competency, cultural humility, and ultimately cultural safety is clear in terms of our engagement with Pacific Islanders and certainly for Chamorros. And so in terms of cultural competency, this is an integration of traditional practices, belief systems, ceremony, and so forth into the working relationship for healing with Pacific Islanders. And so part of cultural competency entails a high level of self-awareness in terms of our own cultural practices, our biases, our prejudices, and having the cultural humility to engage our client systems in a way that's non-judgmental and that builds on the lens and the worldview through which they see the world. And so they're coupled with cultural competency and cultural humility is cultural safety, which is defined as, quote, an environment that is spiritually, socially, emotionally, and physically safe for people, where cultural identity is recognized and valued through shared respect, meaning, knowledge, and the experience of learning together. So in so many ways, this really is the goal in terms of providing culturally based interventions. And so I also wanted to just make a note that healing must take place on both individual and collective levels when we're talking about historical trauma in order to prevent the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And so in this picture here, I have a photo where really the biggest delegation from Guahan to the United Nations to address the intervention of our decolonization. So this is the kinds of activities that happen at the collective level in terms of resolving some of this trauma is to reclaim our history and to take power back by way of remedying the experience of colonization. Okay, I'm a little lost in my note. Okay, and so here are, and this is probably not going to sound particularly innovative, but just as a reminder, a good reminder in terms of agency level strategies that can be employed when working with Pacific Islanders and more specifically with Chamorros. Clearly, the hiring of personnel whose identities reflect the demographic composition of clients. In other words, if you're servicing Chamorros, then ideally you should have staff who are Chamorros. And that cuts through barriers of language oftentimes, it cuts through barriers of understanding the worldview, and it really helps to facilitate engagement and trust with our client systems. In addition, language access and proficiency for limited English speakers is really critical and key. This involves the availability of translators, and that's why hiring personnel who speak a language is really important, but also the translation of materials as well as marketing strategies that particularly reach out to those who do not speak English. In addition, mechanism for consultation with the Manyaina or the elders. And so the incorporation of elders, not just in terms of the planning process, but also in terms of the delivery of the interventions. Because when we understand that the elders are so critical in terms of the structure of our cultural practice, then it is strategic to utilize them as a resource and as an agent, you know, as a mechanism of delivering these interventions to families that we work with. And then the last spoke that I have here in terms of some agency level strategies is the acknowledgement of our ancestors as part of the agency protocols. And so one of my roles at home here is I am a behavioral health provider. I'm an LCSW social worker, and part of my work and is in the engagement process. We have what I call an altar at our clinic where we have photos of our ancestors. And as part of our engagement with our client systems is the introduction, not just of who we are in our present context, but also our family lines. Because for Chamorros, when we meet each other, one of the first things we ask is, oh, who's your family? You know, what village are you from? And we keep doing this sort of relational dance until we come to a place of commonality. And so that acknowledgement of the ancestral line in your clan really helps to facilitate engagement and working relationship together. Looking specifically at interventions, we know how important it is to draw from Indigenous knowledge systems, to incorporate Indigenous practices, as well as the use of elders in the delivery of our services, and of repairing a fragmented identity that oftentimes is secondary to the experience of colonization, and incorporating the connection to spirit and our traditional spirituality. And so clearly culture-based curricula in our work with our clients is indicated, utilizing Indigenous ceremonies, languages, and traditions. In the case of Native Americans, for example, Indigenous ceremonies include smudging, sweat lodges, and so forth. In addition, we look at a focus on the total family system, right? So incorporation of group family counseling as opposed to work just with individuals. And that's largely because we are contextualized in the collective primarily. Utilizing storytelling with the Manyaina, which is our elders and our families. Storytelling, of course, as oral tradition and as Pacific peoples. Stories are our primary mode of learning, of sharing, of transmitting knowledge. And so the incorporation of that in our interventions is really critical. And engaging the stories of our ancestors, right? But part and parcel to the treatment process is also teaching decolonized history and historical accounts, which is why I spent a lot of time in this presentation sharing those accounts in terms of the empowerment of women, in terms of parenting practices that really reflect time out, right, in a modern context, and that reconnection to that sense of power by way of the cultural realities and the cultural identities that people bring into the system. And so also strategic in terms of our work that's culture-based is to utilize legends, chants, and proverbs that are traditionally in our traditions, right? And so this picture here, I know I shared the earlier picture of the legend of the women who saved Guam by way of the fish. And so in this picture is a depiction of a dance, of our traditional dance that speaks of that legend. And so you can see here, it's women in union together. You see the fishing net behind them. And so by way of even traditional dance, chant, and song is a very, the use of the arts is a very important strategy in terms of reconnecting people to their sense of spirit, right? So we can impact the cognitive processes, but oftentimes it is healing that happens at the spirit level from the context of our emotions and so forth that healing also occurs. And so real quick, okay, I wanted to share the legend of Taga, which is a legend that really has elements of family violence and how the use of the legend can be used in our therapeutic work with our client systems. And so I will play it now. Taga. According to CHamoru legend, Taga was born to the Magatlahi, or chief of Ritidian village on Guahan. In the legend, Taga was a giant. Dissatisfied with his father's rule, the boy challenged his father to a fight. When Taga lost the fight, he moved to Luta, where he challenged the leading Magatlahi to a series of contests. Winning these contests, he married a local Chamorro woman and had a daughter. At As Nieves in Luta, he began excavating what would have been the largest latte stones in the Marianas. Perhaps he was trying to impress his father. For an unknown reason, however, Taga moved from Luta to Tinian without lifting the stones out of the ground. As he had on Luta, the giant Taga gained power on Tinian and had a son. He then oversaw the construction of his home, the House of Taga, on San Halom Bay on the southwest coast of the island. The house consisted of 12 latte stones with a wooden house built on top of the stones. When the son of Taga turned 5 years old, Taga gave him a giant azuzu, or coconut crab, as a present. Unfortunately, while the boy was walking the crab, it cut the twine leash and ran under a young coconut tree. The boy ran back to Taga house and asked his father to push over the coconut tree so he could get the crab. Taga refused, explaining that the coconuts were just beginning to bear fruit. The boy became furious. He ran back to the tree and shook it furiously, finally pushing over the tree himself. While the boy was pulling the crab from the hole he had just created, he noticed water. It was fresh water. He gave the well to his half-sister for her to bathe in. When Taga saw his young son perform this great feat of strength, he recognized that the boy might become bigger and stronger than even himself. He remembered fighting his own father. That night, Taga crept into the boy's room and smothered him to death. Taga's daughter saw this. She became so frightened that she ran away to the deep forest and hid. By the time she was returned to her mother, the girl was so weak that she died. Taga buried the girl in a cavity dug in one of the tasa of Taga house. Okay, I don't know what happened, but it just ended. But at the end of, oh, I see what happened. I advanced the slide by accident. Okay, so going back to the legend of Taga, and I won't replay it, but essentially the legend ends with his son, Taga killing his son, his daughter dying of a broken heart, as did his wife, right? So you see that by virtue of Taga and his way, that he really had lost his family. And so by in line with this legend, then you can use different discussion questions, and here's just a handful in terms of dissecting the experience of the violence. And so, for example, how does intergenerational paternal conflict and violence affect generations to come? How does the perpetrator of masculine violence feel as a result of his or her actions? How does the emotion of anger play a role in violence? And, and so forth, right? Does anger and power justify the loss of life? And all the way through. And ultimately, what alternatives to violence could Taga have used to address his feelings of discontent? And so when these kinds of interventions are shared with our people, then clearly they're able to connect and plug in at a much deeper level than in traditional Western curriculum. Okay. Okay, and so then another strategy in terms of working with our client systems is the use of our traditional proverbs. And so here's one proverb that I wanted to share, and I actually, having some issues here. And so I actually did a voice recording because I thought at 3:30 in the morning I might not be able to say it properly, but here it goes. Okay, forget the recording. It's an numa piniti hau tautau, nanga mana pinitimu, masaya at mamana tempo una pasi sa dibimu, which means when you hurt somebody, be expecting to be in pain, for even if it takes time, surely you'll pay for the pain that you caused, right? And so when we're looking at issues of family violence, it's important to explore in the healing process the pain that has been perpetrated, because ultimately the goal is forgiveness, right? And so we need to explore the pain, the guilt that comes from that pain, and ultimately the ability to forgive oneself for the pain that they've caused the people they've loved. And so when it's rooted, not just in the indigenous language, but really in indigenous wisdoms, then it tends to plug in, it allows indigenous people to plug in at a deeper level to their sense of self, as well as to their indigenous spirit and soul. This third intervention I like to share is a family pledge that is taken out of a curriculum that myself, as well as a colleague of mine at the University of Guam, were commissioned to develop called Navigating Personal Wellbeing and Sexuality, a facilitator's guide for working with Chukis and CHamoru communities. And so this project was funded by the Office of Minority Health Resource Center, specifically to address personal well-being issues. And so it's a curriculum based on 10 lessons, and one of the lessons focused on domestic violence. And so as part of that, we have what is called the Inafat Maulik Pledge, which we lead families in making together. And it states, because I love my Manggafa and want only the best for them, I promise to always center Inafat Maulik in our home. I vow to be peaceful and to listen to others. I will tell them how I feel and not let my anger be a reason to hurt or harm them. I will respect how they feel and try to understand them. I will use my hands only for loving and not for hurting. I will use my words only for saying things to make my family feel good about themselves, and I will not abuse with my words. With the guidance of our ancestors, I promise to do the following to practice Inafat Maulik in my home. Then they itemize different things that they're willing to commit to. I make this vow in the spirit of Inafat Maulik and Gwinaidza, which is love. So that's all I have for you folks. Thank you very much. I'm Lisa Natividad, and here's my contact information in case you want to get a hold of me about any of this content or further references that are used. Thank you.